So with Olise, we know that Manchester United and also Chelsea and possibly Manchester City and even Newcastle United, should they find the funds, his head may say Chelsea, but his heart has always said Manchester United because he's a boyhood Manchester United fan.
Hello and welcome to Stretford Paddock. My name is Joe and I'm joined today for a one-on-one interview by sports broadcaster and senior football correspondent at Give Me Sport, Ben Jacobs. Great to have you back on the channel, Ben. How are you doing?
Great to be back. We're in for a busy summer.
Well, I hope so. I mean, one way or another, it's going to be busy. We've got loads to get through today. We're going to be looking at the manager situation, transfers in, transfers out, what is going on at Manchester United. It feels like, I mean, I know there's always more sort of questions than answers with a football club because they know stuff that we don't. But it feels as though, particularly at the moment, there is a lot more questions than there is answers. Let's start with the big question, the manager situation. There's been this sort of post-season review, which, you know, has been going on for 2 weeks post-season now, over 2 weeks. What is your sort of current understanding of the schedule and the timeline of this review, and maybe when we can expect some sort of resolution to all this?
So we're recording this on a Tuesday lunch, and at the moment, both Erik ten Hag is in the dark and Manchester United is still deliberating as part of this review. Now, originally, sources had indicated that the Ten Hag part of the review, in other words, the meetings and the internal discussions, were only going to take 4 or 5 days. But obviously, there's a lot of moving parts at Manchester United, including executives that haven't even started or are only just new to the club. And one of the complications, I'm told, is that it's not just a Ten Hag review looking back, with the high being the FA Cup win and the low being the lowest ever Premier League finish. It's also a projection going forwards as to, does last season matter in the context of Ten Hag being a fit or not, depending on what they decide in the new model. So they're not only having to look back retrospectively, which is what Chelsea did with Mauricio Pochettino with an established model, they're also having to project whether or not things are going to be different in the Premier League at least. And from Ten Hag's point of view, he's been away. And that's another oddity. If you look at the Chelsea review for Mauricio Pochettino, he was in the room for 2 days. So Ten Hag hasn't actually been directly in person anyway, a part of this review. The other thing, which is normal, it's not Machiavellian or anything like that, is whilst reviewing Ten Hag, part of the review is doing due diligence on other candidates as well. And that takes time. So it's not only about, is Ten Hag the right fit going forwards, it's also about who else is out there on the market. And they have to yardstick Ten Hag comparatively. And again, that's because this isn't only a retrospective review based upon the results last season. This is also that projection to work out who is the right fit. And that is why I think it's quite atypical that Ten Hag just went away on holiday. Because if you only take the second point I've made about the projection, then you could make an argument that if Ten Hag is still in the frame, he almost has to in some ways re-interview for his job, not based upon what he's done, but what he could do. Now, sources indicate the reason why he went away is because he's made his case. He's had his conversations with Sir Jim Ratcliffe and his new sporting-led department, so he doesn't need to re-emphasise his position. He thinks that 2 trophies in 2 seasons, plus those meetings, has already provided the input and the information necessary for them to make a decision. So then what's happening now? Well, you can read into it 2 ways. The delay is either because it's a thorough review and it will end up with Ten Hag staying, or the delay is because they're looking at other candidates and they don't want to make a final determination until they know who they may be able to appoint. Otherwise, if you get rid of Erik ten Hag just because that's your decision, but you don't have a replacement lined up and willing to come and endorsed by the board, then ultimately you have managerial limbo. So that's another theory as to why it's taking so long. But the reality is, at the time of recording anyway, it may change in a minute, it may change in an hour, it may not change for another week. But at the time of recording, Ten Hag is still in the dark.
It's a pretty unique situation, this, isn't it? And I think mostly because you don't tend to see this, it's rare, certainly as a United fan, not in my lifetime, have new owners come in and had to consider whether they like this manager or not. The last time new owners came in, it was the Glazers almost 20 years ago, and they would have had to have been completely insane to get rid of Sir Alex Ferguson when they arrived. So this is the first time I'm watching Man United, new owners come in and have a genuine, there's a conversation to be had there around the manager, isn't there? Do you know how confident Ten Hag is in all of this? Because there were reports the other day of he's aware of this, and out of Sky Sports, I think. I mean, of course he's aware of this. If anyone, he's reading the same stuff we're reading, and maybe more. Do you know what his sort of line on this is? Because after the FA Cup final, he was quite bullish, and if you don't want me here, I'll go and win trophies elsewhere. Is that an indication that he's confident he'll stay, or does he sort of saying, do what you want, I'm going to win? But do you think he's confident of staying? What's his thoughts?
Well, he can't be confident when he knows that Manchester United are looking at other options as well. It's not an out-and-out categorical indication that they've decided to move on from Ten Hag, because succession planning and due diligence is a part of this process. And he's aware that as they look forwards, he is going to be yardsticked against other names. And you can't really do that unless you get a feel for other names as well. But ultimately, the only way that Ten Hag could have been and continues to be potentially confident about staying is if he's told that he's staying. And the longer it goes on without him being told that he's staying, then logically, like with any of us in any profession, if you're waiting on a job interview, the less confident you become the longer it goes on. So the most confident that Ten Hag has been is immediately after the FA Cup final, when, as you say, he could be bullish and he could say, I'm the first Manchester United manager since Sir Alex Ferguson to win trophies in back-to-back seasons. But now he's playing the waiting game without, to my knowledge, significant direct input, because that all came before he went away on holiday. Now he's returned from his holidays, so you're either going to get a scenario where he's brought into the review process and maybe can feel more confident that it's still his job to lose, or the review will just go on behind his back and he'll remain in the dark. And it's hard to have any kind of confidence at that point. But we have to be very responsible in how we report this. And I said the same before the FA Cup final, and I'll say the same after. We have to respect what we always knew was going to be an end of season review. And as long as it's ongoing, and even if it appears painstaking to fans, the thoroughness of that will be something that Manchester United bill as proper decision making. And even if it looks callous on Ten Hag, and even if he ultimately ends up going, and even if people think the writing's on the wall because they've read about the meeting with Thomas Tuchel and so on, it is still a bit different to the Glazers' way of doing things, where the manager would always get scapegoated. And probably at some point mid-season, if the Glazers were just doing what they'd always done historically and there was not an incoming Jim Ratcliffe, then Ten Hag might have gone in the middle of the season, in and around the festive period. So it's a different approach. But right now, you have to feel a bit sorry for Ten Hag, because if he gets the job, people will just ask, why did it take so long to decide that he was just going to stay anyway? And if he goes after this lengthy delay, then I think now a lot of Manchester United fans will feel very sorry for him.
I feel sorry for him. That holiday can't have been very relaxing, can it? I've got an image of him sat on the beach with a pina colada in his hand, all sad, just sipping at it, not knowing whether he's going to have a job in a couple of weeks. You mentioned there Thomas Tuchel and others. Just talking, getting into a bit more detail on those names. Thomas Tuchel, I think it seemed as though a couple of days ago, a lot of outlets reported that there had been conversations and that he had decided he didn't want to join Man United. United decided they didn't want him. Is that, as far as you're aware, is that the case, that Thomas Tuchel won't be the next manager?
Yeah, that is my understanding now, and you always get both sides, because if a manager's out the frame, they're going to say they never wanted the job. And if a club decides against moving forwards with the manager, they're going to downplay the significance of the meeting. But my understanding, and I'll repeat what I reported months ago, is that Thomas Tuchel had always been very open to the Manchester United approach and welcomed that meeting with Sir Jim Ratcliffe. So in that meeting, they either realised that they weren't a fit, or alternatively, Manchester United were never as serious about Thomas Tuchel as Thomas Tuchel was about Manchester United. And again, Manchester United will always point out that they're simultaneously still judging Ten Hag and succession planning. So any kind of meeting with any manager is not a formal interview. And if you rule out Tuchel, the last thing that any Manchester United source is going to let slip is that they tried for him, they offered him a job, and Tuchel didn't want it, because then you're in a situation where it's obvious that they're prioritising replacing Ten Hag, lining somebody up, then letting Ten Hag know that he doesn't have a job anymore. And that's not how Manchester United are billing it. They're instead saying there's no timetable and that they are succession planning and doing their due diligence, but that is not a clear clue yet as to whether Ten Hag is staying or going. But I think that the Tuchel side wanted to return to the Premier League. They saw appeal in Manchester United. They wanted to have the conversation. He specifically wanted to have the face-to-face conversation rather than only his people with Manchester United. It happened with Sir Jim Ratcliffe, to my knowledge, as has been widely reported by others as well. And they have gone their separate ways. So we can say now that Thomas Tuchel is not in the frame to potentially be the Manchester United manager if there is a vacancy to emerge. And then it's up really to us as journalists to continue to dig to find out if that's Manchester United driven or Tuchel driven. I'm more inclined, from asking around and speaking to sources, to believe that Manchester United have made the call to move on from Tuchel. And the reason for that is, again, because one, Tuchel was very keen on Manchester United when he was outgoing at Bayern Munich. But the other thing as well is that Manchester United were never committed to Tuchel being, say, the leading candidate or the number one candidate. They were always committed to doing due diligence to understand what went wrong at Bayern, what went wrong at Chelsea. And that's the thing, when you have this kind of new model that's collaborative and will have a lot of cooks, a lot of executives, Ashworth when he comes in, Barada, even though Jean-Claude Blanc is the interim CEO until Barada starts, make no mistake, he will still fulfill roles very similar to what a CEO does, because he's representing INEOS and he's best in class. So you've got a lot of cooks. And when you have a lot of cooks, you have to understand how the manager's going to fit in, not just as a coach, but in terms of a personality and a strategic fit. And this is where there's question marks over Thomas Tuchel, whether rightly or wrongly. There were question marks at Chelsea. He clashed with the co-controlling owner, Paddock. And then at Bayern Munich, we know that it was quite public, his exit, and it was equally public, his almost U-turn, only to not agree terms and have disagreement over recruitment and end up leaving. And there were many people, sources within Bayern Munich, that say they think he didn't agree to U-turn and stay at Bayern because he felt that there was a very serious opportunity to go and manage Manchester United. So we've had quite a consistent narrative of Tuchel wants Manchester United and suddenly he's out the running. And usually that's because the club have decided to either move on to another candidate or obviously stick with Ten Hag.
It's interesting, isn't it? Moving on to talk about another candidate. You mentioned there about a sort of top target, or that Tuchel wasn't that. A few other names that have been mentioned. Pochettino is another one. Obviously, he's sort of not quite the same CV, but a similar CV to Thomas Tuchel actually, but with less trophies on it. Managed at Chelsea, managed at PSG, has been pretty successful, but also not really, if you know what I mean. People like him, but the trophy cabinet doesn't back. He's like the opposite of Tuchel, isn't he? Tuchel will win your trophies, but he falls out with everyone. Everyone likes Poch, but you might not win a much. So is he more down the line of what INEOS are after? Because there was reports, I think, last night, or it was almost like a little report within an article about Tuchel that United had called on Pochettino. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, I think, first of all, it's interesting because when you spell it out like you did, who's in the middle of those two extremes? Eric Ten Hag, where quite a lot of people now like Ten Hag and he's won trophies. So this is probably what makes the review process so difficult. And again, if you look at Chelsea, because they've gone through something very similar, remember Ten Hag, Pochettino in the same boat. Chelsea just moved quicker. They're prioritising, as strange as it may sound, the less established football side, but the strong personality and strategic fit. And that's because they've got to work with this head coach or manager day in, day out. And they need to make sure that he respects and adapts to the model rather than the model adapting to the manager. So One thing we haven't learned, interestingly, with Ten Hag is exactly that, because Ten Hag's been at the football club under the Glazers, under uncertainty. He's had the very sensitive topic of Greenwood to deal with. He's had Ronaldo overshadowing his first season in charge with his very public exit and the Piers Morgan interview. But as yet, we don't really know about Ten Hag times INEOS and the fit, because INEOS haven't laid out yet their recruitment model, because Dan Ashworth's not come in yet due to compensation issues, and Jason Wilcox is kind of running the show, and Omar Barada's not started. So that's the missing piece at the moment. Everyone's talking about fit, but we've not yet seen the model grow past its early stage and theoretical stage to really know. And I think that's what makes the review so hard, because maybe some, certainly Jean-Claude Blanc to my knowledge, are saying, well, shouldn't we just keep stability, try Ten Hag, and see him practice if he works with this model, then make a determination maybe in a year's time. Whereas others perhaps already feel they've got pre-existing information and knowledge of other names. So then coming back to Pochettino, I think the first thing to say is Poch would engage and would be willing to go straight back into work. He's not looking for a long break after leaving Chelsea. The second thing is that I'm not aware of anything particularly advanced between Manchester United and Pochettino yet, in order to be able to rule him out. So if there's a vacancy, we might still find that some kind of conversation takes place between Pochettino and Manchester United. So if they ruled him out, and I respect those reports, it's going to be an internal thing rather than Poch having a significant conversation at this point with Manchester United. And the reason why they may feel they've got more information on Pochettino is that he's not new to the INEOS part of Manchester United. He was considered, along with Graham Potter, for Nice. And as a result, they respect him and they know him well. So I think from Pochettino's point of view, we need to be alert to the fact that with any vacancy, he's prepared to dive straight in. I'm just not aware of anything at this stage that's advanced between Pochettino and Manchester United. So I know it feels like they're kind of crossing off names. And then if Ten Hag stays, some may conclude that he's got the job because they couldn't find somebody better than him. And it's a bit of a backhanded compliment to keep the Manchester United job. But I think that is just the reality of this complex process where you've got to judge Ten Hag. You have got to look at last season. You've got to ask some players. You've got to work out what the mood is towards Ten Hag from within the club before INEOS assume control. Then you've got to work out your new model and project what he'll be like and whether things will change. Then you've got to assess stability, and you've got to ask around in the market to work out who else is out there too. So it isn't just something that you can do collectively overnight. And I feel a bit sorry for, as I said before, Ten Hag, but I also feel a bit sorry for Manchester United in the sense that they can't go out and say, this is our process, this is what we're doing, this is why it's taking so long, these are all the things we're trying, because it's sensitive. So if Ten Hag goes, then Ten Hag's going to get the sympathy and Manchester United are going to get a bit bashed. And if Ten Hag stays, people are going to say, why did it take so long? And I think that's just the nature of the fact that these kind of sensitive processes are not things that they can just air in public, but the ins and outs of the review and all the bits around them are actually really complicated.
Yeah. I mean, one name I want to ask you about, that this is my sort of deduction here, is Thomas Frank, because I remember maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, there are a handful of reports from different outlets, and I can't remember exactly which now, forgive me, that there was a roughly a 4-man shortlist at that time. I think it was, people mentioned McKenna, people mentioned Tuchel, people mentioned Pochettino, and people mentioned Thomas Frank. I mean, McKenna's signed an extension at Ipswich, we're not getting him. Tuchel has had conversations, and it seems like you said that they've gone their separate ways. Pochettino doesn't seem to be advanced and hasn't had any in-depth talks, or doesn't seem like he has. What about Thomas Frank? Because it seems to have gone cold on him. I've not heard his name mentioned in a couple of weeks, and yet if you look at this supposed shortlist, he's the only one left.
Well, I think the difference, though, is that Tuchel and Pochettino are free agents, so there's not really any politics or hurdles to have a conversation, whereas if they want to go down the line of Thomas Frank, who's appreciated, but nothing has moved at this point, you have to respect Brentford in all of this and hold talks with him in a more formal sense. So can you do that before you inform Ten Hag? Probably not. Otherwise, it's a bit disrespectful and it's backwards in terms of how a process would work. I think the reason why the reach out happened to Tuchel is simply because you're just talking to a free agent. It's informal. You don't have to worry about the politics or even to an extent the optics, although those in favour of Ten Hag would obviously point out that maybe they should have informed Ten Hag that that was what they were going to do. But who knows? They might have told him that. They've certainly told Ten Hag that they're doing diligence on other candidates. So he understands this is how the review works. The parameters of the review, including going out into the market and potentially sussing out other people, is part and parcel of how these things take place. And I think Pochettino was aware that Chelsea were doing that as well, because you just cannot have this long managerial limbo where, first of all, you assess Ten Hag, then you decide on Ten Hag, and then you say, okay, well, we've actually done no due diligence, we've done no work, we've got nothing ready because we only wanted to deal with Ten Hag, and now it might take us 3 or 4 weeks, and then you're starting to creep into pre-season. So you have to do the two things concurrently, and Ten Hag's aware of that. But with Frank, you'd have to go to Brentford. So Thomas Frank was in the final two, ahead of McKenna for Chelsea. And the only thing that worked against him really stylistically, which maybe is a bit harsh given that how he would have dealt with Chelsea compared to Brentford are two different things. But the big thing that worked against him was compared to Maresca, and I only mean comparatively, he was seen as playing a less possession-based, more defensive-minded style. But if you give him the Chelsea assets, maybe he would have set up a different way. So I think if Frank comes into the conversation for Manchester United, and again, nothing has advanced at this point, there might be some groans as to, again, whether he's better than Ten Hag. But the plus sides of Frank are seen as his embracement of data, the fact that he worked with a set-piece department, the fact that he's prepared to be collaborative, the fact that he's prepared to be a head coach, the fact that he's prepared to allow others to lead on the recruitment, but is still a big part of the pitch once targets are allocated, the flexibleness with how he plays, the 4-3-3 kind of morphs into different formations on and off the ball in quite subtle ways, but he adapts in game. So I think Frank the tactician is respected as well. So it might feel very underwhelming to Manchester United fans and no improvement on Ten Hag, but where he would score highly, and he scored highly also, by the way, in Liverpool's original due diligence too, is in the fact that if you discount the Brentford part and if you discount what he's done there, and if it feels underwhelming, then take all that away and then look at the other parts in terms of his philosophy, his strategy, his personality, his fit within a model. All of these things clubs like Manchester United see as a plus. But at the time we're recording this, there's nothing to suggest that anything has advanced with Thomas Frank. But I wouldn't expect it to be that way, because I think if it ever got to the point where Frank became a leading candidate, you have to play it by the book. You have to go to Brentford. And at that point, you have to tell Erik Ten Hag that you're definitively looking and that he's out of a job. Otherwise, that's not the right way to go around things. So we're not going to discount Frank at this stage, but I think he would become somebody more spoken about only after it became formal that Erik Ten Hag was out of work, should that eventuality materialise.
Interesting. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Like you said, the guys who are sort of free transfers, if you will, you know, out of a job, it's a lot easier to get to we've almost signed the deal and then we'll get rid of Ten Hag. Whereas the people like Southgate or Frank or whoever who have got a job already, you kind of have to maybe wink, wink, nudge, nudge, agree it, then sack Ten Hag, then formally approach wherever they currently are. Which maybe, you know, you're not saying this, I appreciate, leads me to believe that if they are to sack Ten Hag, it looks like it could well be for someone who's currently in a job. I mean, I haven't mentioned Southgate particularly to you. I've been giving you names here. Is there a person who you think, whether that be from what you've heard or just a gut feeling, that you think could be the sort of the top target if we were to get rid of Ten Hag?
No, I don't think that we have like one name. I think we have this succession planning where what they're trying to do is whittle down names other than Ten Hag to only 2 and then be in a position to move. So we can't rule out Roberto De Zerbi still, although it would be a left field appointment within the model and the profile they're looking for. But he's out of work and wants to stay in the Premier League, and there's a compensation number of around 5 million. I think that if they had decided earlier to depart from Ten Hag, then a serious play would have been made for Kieran McKenna. And it's interesting that McKenna didn't want to wait and see what happened with Ten Hag. He wanted to commit to Ipswich and settle his future. And given he had Chelsea and Brighton as well, that's quite intriguing, because was he to have not signed a new deal at Ipswich, he would have absolutely been in the conversation for Manchester United if a vacancy emerged. But for whatever reason, maybe McKenna just didn't want to go back to Manchester United. If you flash back when he left Manchester United, remember all the reports that kind of threw him under the bus and sort of said he was uninspiring. The players were bored by him. They didn't like working with him. Some of them are still at the football club. Now, look at what he did at Ipswich, the complete opposite. The players would be happy to throw themselves under the bus for their manager. So it's kind of strange. And it just shows you that sometimes when someone departs, the dirty laundry is aired, but we have to put scrutiny on that, because you have INEOS people that would have absolutely considered McKenna, but when you cross-reference that against the post-McKenna exit, there was a lot of negativity. So maybe he remembers that and says, I don't want to walk back into that. I don't buy that it's going to be a different culture. Or maybe he just has respect for Ipswich and realizes that in signing a lucrative new deal, he will still be in a position to go elsewhere in potentially 12 months' time. But either way, he's out the running for Manchester United. But if he didn't sign that new Ipswich deal, I think he would have been one of the prominent names that we would have spoken about. So I would keep an eye on De Zerbi. I think that if Frank is to be approached, they'll play it by the book. We'll have to wait and see. I'm not aware of any contact at this point towards Xavi, who is a free agent and is not necessarily looking for a lengthy break as well. But they're running out of names, obviously, and that might mean that it's good news for Ten Hag. We'll have to wait and see. I don't yet, at the time we're recording, want to put a percentage on Ten Hag staying and going, because it's been 50-50 for so long. It's been 50-50 from before the FA Cup final. I don't think the odds changed just because he won the FA Cup, which might sound strange to some people. But remember, in all of this, INEOS are thinking dispassionately. And sometimes when that gets aggregated or reported, people don't understand the meaning of that word, because it makes it sound like they don't give a damn. There's no passion behind it. But dispassionately is a positive. It means you remove the emotion. So you're not influenced solely by an FA Cup win, and you're not influenced solely by an 8th place finish in the Premier League. What you're influenced by is the data, the facts, different people's opinion, the future. So you're looking at everything and you're trying to remove the emotion from it to make the right decision for the football club. And again, that's probably why this review is taking so long.
Interesting enough. They've got a lot to deal with. I just as a United fan, I appreciate what you're saying, and that they will say we need to be considered and we need to make sure we go through every, almost sort of permutation of what could happen here and do the right thing. But it is, the transfer window opens in 3 days. We need to know something at some point. Some of these players are going to be back for the end of pre-season, or back for pre-season in the next couple of weeks who aren't at the Euros. They need a manager to be on the training ground when they get there. Something has to happen here. Just talking about players a little bit more. There's been a lot of sort of links with different ins and outs. I just want to stick to a couple, because I think, there's an endless number of potential transfers that United could have. Jared Branthwaite and Michael Olise are two names that seemingly more than any other have been repeated and regurgitated and mentioned as linked to United. Firstly, to your understanding, are they both targets of United? And secondly, will those targets change if a new manager comes in or a different manager comes in? Or are we going for a we buy you the players and you make them play kind of model with the new manager, or the manager for next season?
Yeah, I think the manager will be an important part in the recruitment team, but will inherit a summer plan. So no manager is going to be able to have autonomy or veto, which means if they want the names that you mentioned, they'll go for one or both of those names. I think you have to look at Manchester United's business as funded by Outgoings and collective. So if you get an Olise, it's hard to think there's budget for a Branthwaite. And if you get a Branthwaite, it's hard to think that there's budget for an Olise. And the strength in the recruitment is about having depth of targets in each position. So there's more than one option. Rather than looking at targets as number one, number two, number three, recruitment teams look at positions as having 2 or 3 targets that are all good enough and are all credible. So then if you don't get one because you're beaten by a suitor, or you don't get one because another club comes in, or you don't get one because of cost, you're not looking at number 2, number 3, number 4 as the backup and thinking, oh no, we've had to go down our list so far that we're not happy anymore. You're looking at depth. So I come back again to Chelsea, who wanted Michael Olise 12 months ago. They thought they'd triggered the clause. Crystal Palace accused them of kind of tapping up the player or not triggering the clause legally. Chelsea backed off. He signed a new deal, and suddenly the release clause has doubled and is now in the region of 60 to 65 million. And then who did Chelsea sign instead? Cole Palmer. But he was actually the 4th choice on their list. But that doesn't mean that he was the backup to the backup to the backup. It just means you've got depth. And then as you're deciding who to move for, when maybe you miss out on a target, the manager comes in and you have this conversation where there's a freedom to challenge and debate. And that's absolutely vital to any model where you have lots of cooks. So with Olise, we know that Manchester United and also Chelsea and possibly Manchester City and even Newcastle United, should they find the funds, I think it would need a departure of Bruno Guimaraes in likelihood for them to enter the race. They're all there. And there's a few things to note on Olise. Number one is that you have to negotiate with Palace, whether that's because you're informing them you're going to trigger the clause, so not much of a negotiation really, or alternatively, you're going to match the clause or place a lower offer. But the reason why it's complicated is because you can't go to Olise. So we've heard reports that say he's agreed verbal terms with Chelsea. You can't do that unless you've gone to Palace. Otherwise, you're breaking the terms of the clause. You have to go to Crystal Palace before Olise and say either we're triggering the clause or we're presenting an offer. Then Crystal Palace are going to inform Olise, and you either negotiate with Palace or you trigger the clause. If there's an agreement, Crystal Palace go to Olise and say, do you want to accept and trigger your part? Because the player has to also trigger, not just the club, and then you negotiate. So if anyone's gone to the Olise side and pre-agreed anything and then go to Palace, you can logically assume that Crystal Palace are going to say, no, that's tapping up the player. Now, there's a grey area and a lack of understanding in the market, because 9 times out of 10, people go to the player camp first. But as long as there's transparency and communication, then it wouldn't be construed as tapping up. But in this particular case, Palace are clear. If you want to trigger the clause or negotiate around the clause, you go to Palace, you go club to club, then you go to the player. So if anybody is saying Olise's agreed anything, it means that the club have already entered into a conversation with Crystal Palace. And right now, Chelsea are working on Olise. They're deciding whether or not they do want to trigger the clause or whether they want to make a different kind of offer. And Manchester United are expected to be in that conversation as well. But we wait and see whether Chelsea try and move too fast, because Manchester United have got financial considerations as well. I repeat what I said before on Olise, and I think it's quite widespread now, that he's got the history with Chelsea, and his head may say Chelsea, and it's London, and in his mind he'd already joined them 12 months ago before the complications. But his heart has always said Manchester United, because he's a boyhood Manchester United fan. So there's an opportunity for Manchester United, but Chelsea are maybe in a stronger position to move quicker. The other thing in all of this is the Olympics, and whether Olise wants to go now and potentially move to a Chelsea or a Manchester United, who may say, sorry, we need you to withdraw from Thierry Henry's Olympic squad. And if Olise is hell-bent on playing in the Olympics, he may say to clubs, if they don't allow him to, that they're going to have to come back towards the end of the window. And we also shouldn't rule out that Crystal Palace don't want to lose their stars. They had a very positive end to the season, so they'll be fighting hard to try and keep Olise as well. But just keep that Olympics in mind, because he's already been named in the squad. And Chelsea have only allowed Leslie Okwuchukwu to go to the Olympics. No Mudryk, Ukraine, no Enzo Fernandez, Argentina. And those two in particular, along with Benoit Badiashile and Malo Gusto for France, all four really wanted, but particularly the first two, to go to the Olympics. So it doesn't sit well in that dressing room if Chelsea say, well, yeah, but he was already named, so there's nothing we can do. We're going to let Olise go and play for France. But sorry, Malo Gusto and Benoit Badiashile, because we consider you senior players, Leslie Okwuchukwu is a bit more bit part. He'll probably be sent out on loan for his redevelopment. But imagine what those other two French players in the Chelsea dressing room will say if Olise can go at Chelsea in the same France squad, but Gusto and Badiashile can't. So that's a kind of plot twist. And obviously Manchester United would have to make a determination on that as well. And it might be if Olise really wants to go to the Olympics and a Newcastle or a Man United said you can go and a Chelsea said you can't go, and that is expected to be Chelsea's position, that's a factor in his decision making as well. So we're no closer at the moment. It's an open race, but it is true that Chelsea are thinking more seriously about it now, partly because they believe they've got the finances to do it, and also because it's a high priority winger profile that they're looking for right now, maybe even above at the moment that traditional striker, because Sesko's staying at Leipzig and they trust Nicholas Jackson, and they've also got Christopher Nkunku who can play as a false nine. Whereas for Manchester United, first of all, they've got to think, have we got that 60 million? And then they've got to think, if you've got that 60 million, is the priority to put it on a centre-back, or is the priority to put it on a traditional striker? Or because they really like Olise, do you just chuck it on Olise, priority target, but less priority position, and then bank on the fact that you're going to get Sancho money, you're going to get Greenwood money? With Branthwaite, I think Manchester United won't be in a position to move unless the price drops. So I'm told Everton want 70 plus million. And unless it goes to sort of 50, 60 million because of their financial situation, it's going to be very difficult for Manchester United to make that move. We know they tried a late hijack move, as I reported, for Tosin, but it was too far along with Chelsea. But that's an example again of maybe Manchester United saying, well, let's just get the free in and then the centre-back's taken care of. And then that might allow us to go for Olise, sell a Sancho, sell a Greenwood, sell a Casemiro, use that money later in the window to bring in a traditional striker. So everything is a kind of domino effect for Manchester United at the moment, whereas Chelsea, because they're adamant that, contrary to reports, they've not got PSR concerns for this financial year, and they think they're going to get Maatsen money, they think they're going to get Broja money, they think they're going to get Lukaku money. They're happy to kind of pre-spend, so that may allow them to force the issue with Olise quicker than Manchester United are prepared to do. But the short answer to this very long answer with Olise is Hart, historically anyway, has always said Manchester United, but that doesn't mean that there's no appeal in Chelsea, and his head may well say that the Chelsea move is quicker and more valuable to him and more secure because they are moving in concrete terms, whereas Manchester United are yet to make their move to Crystal Palace.
Yeah, there's, like I said at the very start, there's a lot more questions than there is answers around United at the minute, isn't there? Whether it be transfers, whether it be the manager, and like you said, this is a dominoes that's, at the moment, they're all stacked up, but it spreads across the entire club, this sort of domino that we've got set up here. It's the manager then affects what players we want, and the players we sell affects what players we can buy, and you know it's all ticking over. We ain't got a director of football, we haven't got a permanent CEO yet. Like, it feels as though we're just waiting and we need some big answers. I appreciate I've taken a lot of your time here, so I'll just have one more question, and it is on sort of some of the outs that United are looking at people to sort of get rid of in order to fund this spending. You mentioned there specifically Greenwood and Sancho. I'll throw Casemiro in there as well, because I think they're, you know, if United are going to get 30 million for anyone, it's probably those three, maybe, you know, 30 million or more each. What's your understanding on the sort of the willingness to get rid of them and the current kind of willingness for people to buy them?
Yeah, I think, as you say, and you put it very neatly, there's all these moving parts, and this is why people want takeaways. They want to hear from journalists who's going where in one word and for what price, and is Ten Hag staying or going? But you got to understand the complexities, and if you don't want to understand the complexities, then you'll get a black and white, but it will likely be unreliable and changeable. And then you'll go, oh, okay, that black and white wasn't as black and white. So this is why the context, understanding the market, understanding Olise about the Olympics, understanding Manchester United and PSR, understanding the new executives, they're all important. And if someone wants to come and tell you these are the answers, they're jumping ahead of the process. And Manchester United don't know their answers yet on Ten Hag and even on the market. Some of the answers also need to come from the selling club, i.e. the price for Branthwaite. With Tobido, by the way, who we should also mention, it's a little bit different because it's technically Ratcliffe negotiating with Ratcliffe, but that would still have to be done at fair market value. So it's not like they can just hand Manchester United a nice low price bargain. They're going to have to do fair market value on that because it will come under scrutiny. So it still might be out of Manchester United's budget. And obviously those people that are Nice specific, that are not INEOS, are still going to be fighting and saying, wait a minute, you can't just hand him off to effectively your sister club, or I suppose we need to call it kind of step-sister club at the moment because it's quite a complicated structure. But if Ratcliffe controls sporting side at Nice and sporting side at Manchester United, then there is obviously a link there. So fair market valuation would come in. Regarding the outgoings that you mentioned, Casemiro and Saudi is concrete, and the numbers are not as high as have been reported. The Saudis told John Murter, in fact, in January and at the Club World Cup that they were not chucking this 70, 80, 90 million euros number that you hear from certain outlets. My understanding is that the Saudis feel 30 or 40 million euros for Casemiro's as a ballpark, plus some bonuses. So maybe 50 million all in, but that will include the add-ons, and not all of them will necessarily be gettable. And I think for Manchester United, that's good value, that's good money. They're not going to make a profit on what they paid for him, but if they can get the wages off the book, it will allow them to move. And then Christian Eriksen, there's a question mark as well. So you suddenly craft space to bring in a lower budget, likely left-sided midfielder, maybe box-to-box, maybe defensive midfielder that plays in that kind of Toni Kroos mould where they're defensive, but they're kind of a playmaker as well, but from deeper areas. So there's a few names that we can mention that are out there. You got João Gomez, you got Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall. These kind of players may come into consideration. And if you could sell Casemiro for 30 million guaranteed in euros plus some bonuses and bring in a player like Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall for a similar amount, I only use him as an example because I think the number he may go for will be somewhere around that kind of 30 million, 35 million amount. So very similar. That might be deemed to be a relatively good bit of business for Manchester United. So we'll wait and see on Casemiro, but you've got Al Nassr and Al Hilal, the two Riyadh clubs, really pushing on that one at the moment and working out what's possible. And then we will see an official approach either directly to the player first or to Manchester United. And I think if Casemiro gives the green light, Manchester United will not stand in his way. With Jadon Sancho, the priority is to get a minimum of 40 million. But I'm still told that Manchester United would ideally like 50 million. So we might find that it's 35, 40 million up front, 5 or 10 million in bonuses, but 40 million or above is what Manchester United would like. And that's consistent with the number that they gave to Saudi Arabia 12 months ago when Al Ittifaq made an inquiry. And Dortmund do see Sancho as one of their priorities, but there's two names above him. One is Ian Maatsen, and the other is Stuttgart's Sergio Guirassy. So it's like strange because if you look at Dortmund and you say you got Bellingham money, you got the Champions League final, and you got Champions League again for next season because Germany got the 5th place, they've got plenty of money. So for them to say we can't afford Sancho at 40 million, which I actually think is a very reasonable number, we can't pay the 35 million clause for Ian Maatsen, we don't want Sergio Guirassy, who, remember, throughout the last few windows has always had a very valuable below market value release clause. So Dortmund could get Sancho, Guirassy and Maatsen for basically 100 million quid. But they're saying, no, we've only got 60 million to spend. And I know this is how they do business, and you have to respect that, because it constantly means they're difficult to negotiate with. But if they really want Sancho, they can afford Sancho, along with Gerassi and along with Maatsen. They just need to dig into some of their Champions League money and dig into some of their Bellingham money. But I think the question mark over Sancho is down to the fact that I think he's number 3 on their list of all high targets. But if you really force them to rank them, I'm told it's 1 Maatsen, 2 Gerassi, 3 Sancho, which may open the door to other suitors. Or, of course, if Ten Hag goes, still have the eventuality that he returns to Manchester United, because his issue is with Ten Hag, not the football club. But again, and this is why the context matters, come back to what I said before. In order for Manchester United to go big on an Olise, on a Branthwaite, on a Tobido, on a midfielder, etc., they got to find outgoings. So to fund their window, they're banking on the fact that they can get that Sancho money and they can get that Greenwood money. So this isn't only about taking the players in isolation and saying, well, if Dortmund are not paying up, let's bring him back to Manchester United because he might be valuable. This is about Manchester United saying Greenwood plus Sancho needs to bring us in 80, 90, 100 million collectively. So then we can go out there and enter the race for an Olise, a Branthwaite, a Tobido, and so on. So this is where you have to sacrifice something in order to satisfy PSR concerns and have enough budget to go out there and have a big first window. Otherwise, Manchester United won't be able to do as much business as they would like. And that's why I suspect at the end of the day, there will be some flexibility on price with Sancho and Greenwood to make sure they do get the fees required for both of them to allow them to bring in some fresh faces, either for Ten Hag or a new manager.
With Greenwood then, is there any, you mentioned with Sancho, and I'm not going to get into it again with this Dortmund thing because I've been saying this for weeks about what they always pretend they've got no money, we can't afford this, we can't afford. They are as good at selling players as any club on the planet. I can think of £400 million, or no, not quite 100, but around the 100 million region pretty quickly. And yet they never have any money to buy anyone. And I don't quite understand it, but we'll save that for another time. But on Greenwood, are there any... There was rumours of Barcelona. There was rumours of more than one Premier League club, but were never mentioned. There's reports of Saudi Arabia. Is there any concrete interest in Mason Greenwood at the moment?
Yeah, just on the Dortmund thing, the reason is they look at their buying and selling models as different. So most clubs would say, we've got a load of money from Bellingham, let's spend it. But Dortmund budget certain amounts. And then if you get a Bellingham sale, the cream on top is invested into academy or infrastructure, right, or just held to make the club ultimately a profit and be sustainable. And then you've got funds in reserve. So then they'll set a number. And even though logically everyone at the football club will know they've got more money than that, that is their model, to be very strict. And it's probably as frustrating to Edin Terzic as anybody else, because he's saying, well, I also know we've got the money, so let's just dip into those reserves. And who knows, that may be what they do, but it's not like they determine what they can spend based solely on that Bellingham fee or other things they've brought in. They're very strict, and it's what makes them a sustainable model and ultimately a selling club that can turn a profit. With Greenwood, the Saudis had always distanced themselves to me. And despite constant links, the central deal makers did not want to engage with Greenwood. Now the dust has settled, we wait and see. But the optics of engaging with Greenwood at the time Manchester United decided he needed to go elsewhere were seen as something that the Saudis felt was not beneficial. And as much respect as they had for Greenwood, the footballer, they didn't want anything to do with it, much like a lot of other clubs, I think, as well. Yeah. Now he's gone and done very well and enjoyed his time in Spain. It's normal that other Spanish clubs are looking. And I can certainly confirm that Barcelona like Greenwood, but they can't afford Greenwood. So there's nothing to suggest that Barcelona are going to be able to pull that off. So I think the situation is that Manchester United are now, because time has passed, not putting a price on Greenwood that is seen by suitors as a bargain or cut price. They're looking for the same or more than Sancho, which means that even if they went down in number, you'd be looking at 40 million for Greenwood. And actually, I think Manchester United want 50 million if they can get it for Mason Greenwood. And I think if you're a Barcelona, you need a loan with an option, or you need that price tag to half, and you still need outgoings. Because remember, Barcelona's priority is to keep Joao Felix permanently and to keep Cancelo permanently. And that requires outlay, or that requires a structure that buys them a bit of time. So they don't just have that 40, 50 million, or even arguably 25 million lying around for Greenwood. So I think it's going to take a bit of time to resolve. The Real Madrid admiration was there, but they've done big business for Mbappe. They're not looking to move at this point. We know that Getafe would love to be able to keep Greenwood, but unless they get another loan that buys some time, I don't think that's a realistic possibility, and they certainly can't afford to sign him permanently, and they know that. So the interest from La Liga is genuine, but there's hurdles and there's complications, and some are starting to bring Atleti into the mix as well. My understanding on Atleti is that would only happen if Alvaro Morata was to leave, and there is some interest in Morata from Serie A and also from Saudi and Al Shabab, who have tried in the last 2 windows to sign Morata. So they could be one to watch, but again, it would need outgoings first. And then people talk about other Premier League interest as well. No one that I know has come forwards yet. We hear plenty of rumours, we hear plenty of unnamed Premier League clubs. But I think all Premier League clubs are doing the same thing as Manchester United. They're assessing the sensitivities behind the deal. And anyone from the Premier League that move, and anyone within Manchester United determining Greenwood's future, are not only thinking about this in monetary and football terms, they're also making sure that they respect the review process that went on. And if they depart from that review process and were to bring him back to Manchester United, then they need to make sure that all stakeholders are spoken to, and that players, management, staff, executives, everyone at the club really is comfortable with that. And they need to think about Greenwood as well, and what kind of reception he'd get from Manchester United fans, from opposing fans, and everything needs to be taken into account. So Ratcliffe has said on record the situation is open, and that he'll assess everything, including bringing him back to Manchester United. And I think he has to say that, because if you only look at it in financial terms, he's a Man United asset. So if Ratcliffe comes out and says he's definitely not coming back, he's definitely not got any future, the decision's made, then every single suitor's going to say, well, here's 5 million, here's 10 million, here's 15 million, here's a loan without any commitment. And Manchester United's negotiation position is weakened. So it's smart of Ratcliffe, whether it's genuine or not, to be talking about all options being open, because it gives Manchester United the strongest possible position to negotiate from. But the reality of the situation is that it remains likely, if not near definite, that Manchester United are looking to sell Mason Greenwood, and then it's about what kind of price they can get. And if no one will offer them the money that they're looking for, then you have to reconsider things like a loan or bringing him back for pre-season. But the Manchester United aim, strategically and financially, and the priority is to try and get that healthy fee for Greenwood, which, as I said before, will then help fund their summer activity.
Blimey. I feel like, I know obviously as fans you want everything to be done really early, and they get sort of an anxious feeling when stuff isn't happening. You see City agreeing deals for people and all this. So I know it's kind of skewed, but it does feel as though we're very much no decisions on anything have been properly made yet, and it is getting a little bit slightly frustrating, I think, for United fans. But like you said, there's so many things working in opposition against each other. Like, it's like trying to buy a house, isn't it? They've got to sell their house and buy their next house, and that person's got to sell and buy. Like, transfers are like, 4 or 5 different working parts or more go into these things. So I appreciate why it takes such a long time.
I also just think on that, people think they're doing nothing, right? But they made a late hijack for Tosin. They're across Olise. Yeah. They're shortlisting potential striker options to know who they can move for. They may want to wait from a recruitment point of view to be scouting and looking at things like the Copa America and the Euros. Jason Wilcox is brand new to the role. Barada starts in a couple of days. They don't yet have a deal compensation-wise for Ashworth. So there's a lot of moving parts, but even with those moving parts, they have the pre-existing plan that Murta put in place. And as I think I said many, many times, and the same in January, that plan was around outgoings. It was around squad refresh. It was around reducing the average age, and then finding a young left back, finding a traditional striker to support Rasmus Højlund, and then seeing where they needed to strengthen, because this was way earlier in the year, based on Varane, who we now has now gone, based on Martial, who we now know has gone, based on Sancho and Greenwood, who are likely to go. So you have to kind of understand what's coming in, and that leads to uncertainty. But when they're understanding what's coming in financially, it's not like they're not doing anything. As I exclusively broke and is now confirmed by multiple outlets, Milos Kerkez for left back, one possibility. The centre-back, they don't need to do that much because they know that Branthwaite's one option. They tried for Tosin. They really like Tobido. The feeling with Tar, who's often been linked with Manchester United, is that he's going to end up at Bayern, but you kind of got your names there. They've got an idea of who they would move for in central midfield. They know that Olise will be a priority if they can afford him and persuade the player to join. So the only real... well, who would be their number one right now is actually in the striker front. And part of that is, again, they presented a project to Sesko. He stayed at Leipzig. So we can't say they've not done anything. They were in the conversation for Sesko. They were in the conversation for Tosin. They're allocating targets in other positions. They want to watch the Euros and the Copa America, and they want to finalise their plans based upon the budget available, the outgoings, and they want to wait for, obviously, their executive team to build. So give Wilcox a chance, because he's going to be leading on this summer. Jean-Claude Blanc is interim CEO. Barada will obviously have some input to the wider model, and they need to get Ashworth over the line. So they're doing lots of things. It's just unfortunate that some of them haven't come off, and others of them need time to come off.
Brilliant. Right. Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you. Sorry for taking up so much of your time there, but I feel like we got into everything there. I know basically the inner workings of Manchester United now, so thank you very much for that. Thank you for coming on, and thank you for watching at home as well. This has been a one-on-one interview with Ben Jacobs. Thanks for watching.